The old man told me there are 3 rules for walking the Virginia backwoods after dark, and the first one was the one he made me repeat back to him twice. If you hear your own name called from the trees, you do not answer, not even to say no, not even to breathe wrong, because the thing that lives in those hollows does not have a voice of its own. It borrows. It listens to you for a long time before it ever lets you know it is there, and when it finally speaks, it speaks in the voice of someone you love. Silas Renfro trapped those ridges for more than 60 years. He knew every creek and every laurel thicket and every old stone that had no business being where it sat. He had buried 2 brothers and 1 son up on that mountain, and he told me flat out that only one of those 3 had died the ordinary way. When a man like that leans across a wood stove and tells you to keep your mouth shut in the dark, you do not laugh. You write it down. And that is exactly what I did. But here is the part that kept me up at night long after Silas was in the ground. The thing he warned me about is not the strangest part of this story, because when I went looking for where it came from, when I started pulling threads on why a stretch of ordinary Appalachian forest would grow a legend this specific and this old, I found something under those woods that should not exist, something older than the trapper, older than the county, older than the history books are willing to admit was ever there at all. Now, before we go a single step further into these woods, I want you to do one small thing for me. If you have ever felt watched in a place where you knew for a fact you were alone, if the hair on the back of your neck has ever stood straight up for no reason you could put a name to, then type the word "remember" down in the comments right now. Just that one word. Remember. It matters more than you know, and by the end of this you will understand exactly why I am asking. Go ahead and do it now. I will still be here when you get back. Silas Renfro was born in a cabin on the far side of Clinch Mountain in the last years of the 1800s. He would not tell me the exact year, and I came to understand that was on purpose, because Silas did not like putting true things down where they could be counted and filed and used. He grew up in a world that had 1 foot in the modern age and 1 foot somewhere much older, a world where the county seat had a telegraph and a courthouse of cut grey stone, and where the back hollows still ran on knowledge that had been handed down mouth to ear for longer than anyone could measure. His grandmother, he said, could stop blood with a verse. His grandfather could find water and find bone and find things that were lost, and he taught Silas that the woods around them were not empty and never had been. The Virginia backwoods that Silas walked are not the gentle green postcard that most people picture when they think of the Appalachians. Down in the deep hollows, where the ridges pinch together and the sun only reaches the creek for a couple hours a day, the country turns strange and close and old. The trees grow tall and dark, and the ground stays wet even in a drought. There are places back in there where your compass will swing for no reason a geologist can explain, where sound does not carry the way it should, where you can shout and hear nothing come back and then hear your shout come back an hour later from the wrong direction entirely. Silas knew all of those places. He had names for them that were not on any map, and he knew which ones to stay out of. The first time he ever told me about the thing, we were sitting in his cabin in the last cold week of an October, and the fire was popping in the stove, and he was working a knife along a hickory stick just to keep his hands busy. He did not build up to it. He did not clear his throat and warn me that what he was about to say would sound crazy. He just said it, the way you would tell a man the creek was up. He said there was something that walked the ridge above his place, and it had walked that ridge longer than his family had been on the mountain, and it kept to a line. That was the word he used, a line. He said if you knew where the line was, you were mostly safe, and if you did not, you would learn it the hard way, or you would not come back to learn anything ever again. I asked him what the line was, and this is where the whole thing turned from a ghost story into something that has never let go of me since. Silas set down his knife. He got up, slow, the way old men move when their knees have carried them across too many mountains, and he went to the corner of the cabin and came back with a flat piece of slate about the size of a dinner plate. On it, scratched in with the point of a nail over what must have been years, was a map, not a map of roads, a map of stones. He had marked every one of them. Up along the spine of that ridge, running for better than 2 miles, there was a line of old stones set into the earth, big ones, squared ones, not the round river rock and not the raw broken shale that the mountain makes on its own, but cut stone, worked stone, laid end to end by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Silas said his grandfather had shown them to him, and his grandfather's grandfather had shown them to his grandfather, and nobody in the family knew who had set them or why. They only knew two things about that line of stone. The thing on the ridge would not cross it, and the smell of wet clay always came before it did. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it is the hinge that everything else in this story hangs on. An old trapper, deep in the Virginia mountains, is telling me that a line of cut and squared stones, laid by unknown hands in a time nobody can remember, is the only thing holding back whatever walks that ridge at night. He did not think of it as a mystery. To him it was just true, the way the seasons are true. But to me, sitting there with my recorder running, it opened up a door I have never been able to close. Before we move on to the builders who came before, stop for a second. What you just heard about the line of old stones the thing will not cross is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the recordings of Silas himself. The old stone line, the smell of wet clay, it's all in the document link below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Now, let us talk about who could have laid those stones. Because the official answer, the answer you will get from the historical marker down by the highway and from the county records office, is that nobody did. There is no record of any structure on that ridge. There is no record of a settlement, no record of a fort, no record of anything at all before the first land grants of the late 1700s. According to the paperwork, that mountain was empty wilderness until white settlers pushed into it, and whatever the settlers found, they did not write down, because, as far as the record is concerned, there was nothing to find. But Silas told a different story, and it is the same story you will hear, in pieces, all up and down the Appalachian chain if you know how to listen for it. He said the old people were here first, not the tribes that the settlers met, though he respected them and said they knew more than the settlers ever gave them credit for. He meant the ones before even them, the builders, the ones who had cut and squared the stone and laid the line and raised things on that mountain that were pulled down or buried or simply lost so long ago that even the tribes only spoke of them as a story their own grandfathers half remembered. Silas said the builders were gone, but they left the stone, and they left the line, and they left the thing that the line was made to hold. Now, if you have spent any time at all looking into the hidden history of this continent, you already feel the ground shifting under you, because this is where the trapper's mountain folklore runs straight into something much bigger. All across the Appalachians, and honestly all across the world, there are stone structures that do not fit the story we have been told. There are walls in New England that run for miles through forest that was supposedly never cleared. There are chambers of fitted stone that predate every explorer who was supposedly the first to arrive. There are earthworks and mounds and squared foundations, and, in more places than the textbooks will ever admit, cut stone laid with a precision that our official timeline says should not have been possible by anyone who was supposedly there. And here is the piece that turned my blood cold when I first understood it. Silas told me that the line of stone on his ridge was not the top of anything, it was the top of something buried. He said if you dug down beside those stones, and he had as a boy on a dare from his brother, you would find that each one kept going, down and down. The stone you could see was the very top edge of a wall that ran deep into the mountain, deeper than any wall has a reason to run, as if the whole structure had been swallowed by the earth, and only its uppermost course was left showing above the dirt like the last inch of a drowning man's hand. Swallowed by the earth, buried up to its own rooftop. I want you to hold on to that image, because if you have ever gone down the rabbit hole of the old world and the great reset of history, you know that image. You have seen it in 100 photographs of buildings across this country and across Europe, buildings whose ground floors sit below the current street, whose windows are half sunk into the soil, whose front doors open now onto packed dirt, because the entire world seems to have risen up around them by a full story or more. The official explanation is always the same. They built low. Trekking. They filled it in on purpose. The dirt accumulated naturally over the years. But when you see it enough times, in enough places, all the same, you start to ask a different question. You start to ask what buried them, and you start to ask when. Silas did not use fancy words for any of this. He had never heard the phrase Great Reset, and he would have thought it was foolish if he had. But he knew, in his own plain mountain way, the exact thing that all of that research circles around. He knew that something had come down over this land a long time ago and covered what was here before. He called it the Great Burying. He said his grandmother's grandmother had a word for it that he could not pronounce any more, and that the old folks said it had come as mud. As a wall of mud and water that filled the hollows to the brim and drowned the low places and buried the works of the builders where they stood. Afterward the mud dried and the trees grew up over it and the world forgot. But the mountain remembered, and the thing on the ridge remembered, because the thing on the ridge, Silas believed, had come up out of the mud. Let me tell you about the first time Silas actually saw it, in his own words as near as I can give them to you, because this is where the folklore stops being a theory and starts being a night that a real man really lived through. He was a young man then, maybe 17 or 18, out running a trapline in the deep cold of February. He had a string of sets running up a side hollow that fed into the main creek, and he was checking them at first light the way you have to, before the ravens and the foxes get to your catch. It had snowed in the night, a fine dry powder, and the whole world was white and silent and perfect, and Silas said he remembered being happy, just a boy alone in the cold with good work to do. And then he came around the base of a big rock outcrop and the smell hit him, wet clay. Thick and cold and wrong, the smell of a creek bank turned over, the smell of a fresh grave, and it had no business being there in the dead of a hard frozen February when the whole ground was locked up stone hard under the snow. He stopped. He said the smell was the first rule, and he did not know it yet, but his body knew it, the way your body knows to freeze when something large moves in the corner of your eye. And then he looked down at the fresh snow, the perfect unbroken snow that had fallen all night, and he saw the tracks. They came down off the ridge. They crossed the hollow, and they were not the tracks of anything he had a name for. They were too long. That was the first thing. Each one was better than twice the length of his own boot, and narrow, and they sank deep, deeper than a bear, deeper than a man, as if whatever made them weighed far more than its size should allow. But that was not the thing that made him back away with his heart slamming in his chest. The thing that did that was the shape. Because the tracks were not the tracks of an animal that walks the way animals walk. The stride was wrong. The spacing changed. In one stretch the prints were close together, like a man taking small, careful steps, and then, without any transition at all, they stretched out to a spacing that no living thing on 2 legs or 4 could have covered in a single step, 10 feet, 12 feet, as if the thing had simply been in one place and then in another with nothing in between, and they went right up to the line of stone. And they stopped, and on the far side of the stone, in the perfect snow, there was nothing at all. Silas did not check the rest of his trapline that day. He walked home the long way, out in the open, along the creek where he could see in every direction, and he did not run because his grandfather had told him, "You never run, running tells it you are prey." And when he got home, his grandfather took one look at his face and said only one thing. He said, "It is awake again. Go get the salt." Now I have to stop the story here for a moment, because I know exactly what a lot of you are thinking. You are thinking, this is just Bigfoot. This is just another hairy man-in-the-woods story, dressed up in old-timey language. And I understand why you would think that, and I want to be honest with you, because I promised myself when I started telling this that I would not cheat you. There are parts of Silas Renfro's account that line up with the ordinary, tall, hairy creature that people report all over these mountains. The size, the smell, the sense of being watched. If that were all there was to it, I would tell you so, and we could have a nice, comfortable conversation about an animal that science has not catalogued yet, and you could go to bed and sleep fine. But that is not all there was to it. Because the tall, hairy creature that people report in these mountains does not stop at a line of ancient stone. It does not borrow the voices of the dead. It does not come only after the smell of wet clay in a frozen February when there is no clay to smell. And it most certainly does not, as Silas swore to me it did, know your name. The voice thing is what separates this from every ordinary cryptid story I have ever come across, and it is the part that even Silas would not talk about easily. He told me that the thing learns you. It watches a person, sometimes for years, and it learns the voices of everyone in that person's life, and then it uses them. He said his uncle was called out of a hunting camp one night by the voice of his own wife, crying and calling his name from down in the dark timber, begging him to come quick. And his uncle knew, he knew for a fact, that his wife was 40 miles away and 8 months along and could not have walked to the end of the lane, let alone up a mountain in the black of night. But it was her voice. It was exactly her voice, down to the little catch she got when she was truly afraid, and every part of him that was a husband wanted to go to her. He did not go. He was one of the ones who knew the rules. He sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees, and he did not answer, and he did not move, and the voice came closer and closer through the dark, still crying, still calling his name, until it was right at the edge of the firelight. And then, Silas said, it stopped crying, and in the same voice, his wife's voice, sweet and close and utterly calm now, it said, "Why won't you come to me?" And his uncle sat there until the sun came up, and the voice talked to him all night, and by morning it was gone. When he got home 3 days later, his wife had never left the house. But she told him something that made him sit down hard in the doorway. She said that on that same night, 40 miles away, she had woken from a dead sleep with the absolute certainty that her husband was standing at the foot of the bed, calling her name. Except he was not there. And he had been calling her from outside, from the yard, in the dark. She had almost gone out to him. It works both ways. Do you understand what I am telling you? It does not just imitate the voices of your loved ones to lure you into the woods. It imitates your voice to the ones who love you. It is not one thing in one place. It reaches. And that is the point where the trapper's warning stopped being a campfire story to me and became something I genuinely could not explain and could not stop thinking about. So let us talk about the rules, because Silas gave me all of them, and he was very clear that the rules were not superstition. They were not lucky charms or old wives' comfort. They were, he said, the accumulated dying words of everyone in these hollows who had figured out one true thing before the thing on the ridge got them. Every rule, he said, is a grave. Somebody had to die for us to know it, so you honor it. The first rule you already know. If you hear your name called from the trees, you do not answer. Not to accept, not to refuse, not to ask who is there. You give it nothing. Because the moment you answer, Silas said, you have told it that you can hear it, and once it knows you can hear it, it has you. The game changes. Before you answer, you are a person it is studying. After you answer, you are a person it is hunting. He said the ones who vanish are almost always the ones who called back, even just once, even just to say who's there, because who's there is an answer, and the woods do not forgive an answer. The second rule is about iron and salt. Silas kept a line of salt across every threshold of his cabin, and he kept cold iron over the doors and the windows, an old horseshoe, a broken ploughshare, a length of chain. He said the builders knew about iron. He said that was why the old stone line worked, because down in the deep courses of that buried wall, where he had dug as a boy, the stones were pinned together with iron. Great black spikes of it, hand-forged, older than forging had any right to be in this part of the world. The thing would not cross iron, and it would not cross salt, and Silas believed the two were really the same secret told two different ways, that both of them were the earth's own bones and the earth's own blood, and that the thing that came up out of the mud could not abide the clean, hard things that the mud had not made. The third rule was the one he told me last, and the one he made me swear I understood. The third rule is that you never, ever dig. You do not open the ground on that mountain. You do not move the stones. You do not go down after whatever the builders buried, no matter what you find, no matter what it promises you, no matter how much the ground seems to want to show you. Because the line is not a fence, Silas said. A fence keeps a thing out. The line is a lid, and whatever is under it is not on the ridge with us. It is below us. And the thing that walks the ridge, the thing that borrows the voices and leaves the wrong tracks in the snow, that thing is not the danger. That thing is the warning. It walks the line, he said, the way a man walks the top of a dam and watches for cracks. It is not there to hunt us. It is there to keep us from opening the lid. And the reason it hunts the ones who break the rules is that the ones who break the rules are the ones who might dig. I did not understand that when he first said it. I understand it now, and by the end of this, so will you. Let me tell you about the ones who broke the rules. because Silas kept a kind of ledger of them in his head, and he recited them to me the way another man might recite scripture. He did not tell these stories for entertainment. He told them the way a doctor tells you the symptoms to watch for, so that you will know the thing when it comes for you and not mistake it for anything ordinary. There was a timber crew, back before Silas was even born, that came into that country to cut the big virgin poplar and oak that stood in those hollows in the old days. Outsiders, company men, who did not know the mountain and would not have listened if they had been told. They set their camp up in the wrong hollow, right below the buried wall, and the local men who hauled for them tried to warn them off and got laughed at for their trouble. The company men heard the voices in the first week and thought it was the local boys playing a trick. They heard their own names and they answered, all of them, cussing and yelling back into the dark, because that is what a certain kind of confident man does when the dark says his name. By the end of the month, Silas said, 3 of them were gone, not dead, gone. There were no bodies, and there was no blood, and there was no sign of a struggle. There were only the boots, left standing neatly side by side at the edge of the timber where the men had last been seen, empty, laced up, pointing into the woods. And around the boots, in the churned mud, the wrong tracks, the long ones, the ones that changed their spacing, leading in, never leading back out. The company pulled the whole operation after that and never came back, and the official story, the one that made it into the one thin newspaper of the day, was that 3 men had deserted the camp and walked off to seek work elsewhere. Deserted. Left their boots behind and walked off barefoot into a mountain winter to seek work elsewhere. That is the kind of explanation the record gives us, over and over, when it runs up against something it cannot afford to write down. It gives us a story that is stupid on its face, because a stupid story that fits the timeline is safer than a true story that does not. There was a preacher, a real one, a hard-shell mountain preacher who did not hold with any talk of the old people or the great burying, and called it all devilment and idolatry. Silas respected him and feared for him in equal measure. This preacher decided that the line of stone was a heathen altar, and that the right and godly thing to do was to tear it down and break it up and end the superstition once and for all. He went up on the ridge with a maul and a pry bar and 2 of his sons, in the daylight, with the whole thing prayed over and blessed, absolutely certain that his faith was armour enough. And he got 1 stone loose, just 1. He levered up one of the great squared stones out of the line and rolled it aside, and underneath it, his sons later said, the ground was not ground. It was black, and it was smooth, and it was worked, and there was a seam in it, a straight cut line running off into the dark under the dirt, and out of that seam came the smell of wet clay so strong that both boys were sick where they stood. The preacher went home that night shaken but alive, and he told his congregation he had faced down the works of the devil and prevailed, and for 3 days nothing happened. And then on the 4th night his wife heard him get up from the bed and go to the door and open it and step out into the yard, and she heard him talking to someone in a low and happy voice, and she got up and looked out, and there was no one in the yard but her husband, standing in the moonlight in his nightshirt, his back to the house, talking and nodding to the empty dark. She called to him, and he did not turn. She went out to him and touched his shoulder, and he turned around, and Silas would never tell me what she saw in his face, only that she never spoke of it, and that the preacher was found the next morning a mile up the ridge, sitting with his back against the very stone he had moved, stone dead, no mark on him, his eyes open, and his boots, Silas said, set neatly side by side 10 feet away, pointing into the woods. His sons put the stone back. They put it back exactly where it had been, and they pinned it down with a length of log chain, and they never told the congregation the truth, and both of them left the mountain the following spring and never returned. The line was whole again, and whatever had been getting ready to come up through the seam under that one moved stone went back down and waited, because that, Silas said, is the whole terrible patience of it. It has all the time there is. It buried the world once. It can wait 100 years for one more lid to come loose. Now I know how this sounds. I know that a sceptical mind, a good, honest, sceptical mind, has an answer for every single piece of this. The tracks were a bear walking in its own old prints and melting the snow. The voices were the wind and the whip, poor wills, and a frightened imagination. The vanished men really did desert. The preacher had a stroke or a heart attack, which happens to angry old men who swing a maul on a cold ridge. And every one of those explanations is reasonable, and I am not going to stand here and tell you they are impossible, because I respect you too much to insult your intelligence. But I am going to ask you to do the same thing I did, which is to stop looking at each piece by itself and start looking at all of them together, and then to add in the one piece that Silas did not have, the piece I went and found for myself after he was gone, the piece that took this whole thing out of the realm of mountain folklore and dropped it squarely into the middle of the hidden history of this entire continent. Because I did what Silas told me never to do, in a manner of speaking, I did not dig into that mountain, but I dug into the record, and the record is where the bodies are truly buried. Here is what I found. That county, the one whose office told me there was no structure ever recorded on that ridge, was not the first county there. It was the third. Before it there was another county, with different lines and a different seat, and its records were lost, they say, in a courthouse fire. And before that one there was another, older still, whose very name appears on exactly 2 surviving maps and on nothing else at all, as if it had been reached into and plucked out of history by a careful hand that missed 2 spots. And on one of those 2 old maps, the older one, drawn before the official settlement of that country was supposed to have begun, there is a mark on that ridge, a small square symbol, the kind a mapmaker uses for a structure, a fort, a work of stone, right where Silas said the line runs. On a map that predates the first white man who was supposedly ever to set foot there. Somebody knew, somebody drew it, and then the county that knew burned, and the county that replaced it lost its papers, and the county we have now says there was never anything there at all. That is not an accident. That is not the ordinary sloppiness of history. That is a pattern, and once you learn to see the pattern, you will see it everywhere, and you will never be able to unsee it. Because this is the thing they do not want you to sit with for too long. All across this continent, the deep history, the real history, the history before the history, has been fought over and burned over and paved over with a thoroughness that starts to look intentional the longer you stare at it. The great mound cities of the river valleys, larger than London was at the same time, ploughed flat and denied and forgotten. The stone chambers of the northeast, older than any people the textbooks will allow, explained away as colonial root cellars. The star-shaped forts, hundreds of them, of a design and a precision that appears all over the earth at once, on every continent, built by peoples who supposedly had no contact and no shared knowledge, all of them now sitting half sunk in the modern ground with their lowest levels buried, always up to the same drowned height, as if the same tide of mud rose over the whole world in the same age, and no one is allowed to ask what it was. That is the water Silas Renfrew's mountain was swimming in, and he never knew the half of it, and neither did I until I went looking. His grandmother's great burying, the wall of mud and water that filled the hollows and drowned the works of the builders, is the exact same event, told in the exact same terms, that you will find whispered in the folk memory of people who never met each other and never could have, in the mountains of Virginia and the plains of Central Asia and the villages of the Old World, all describing a time when the world was covered and remade, and the memory of what came before was buried along with its cities. Silas called it the Great Burying. Other people have called it the Flood, the Deluge, the Reset, the Mud Flood, the drowning of the First World. They are all pointing at the same thing. And the reason they are all pointing at the same thing, the reason the story survives in 1,000 disconnected mouths, is that it happened. And if it happened, then Silas Renfrew's line of stone is not folklore, it is architecture. It is the top course of a buried wall raised by the builders of the First World, pinned with forged iron by people our history says could not forge, and left as a lid over something they decided the Second World should never reach. And the thing that walks the ridge, the thing that borrows the voices and leaves the tracks that change their stride, is not a cryptid and not a ghost and not a bear in old snow. It is a watchman. It was set there, or it stayed there, to keep the lid closed. And it has been doing its terrible job, patiently, for longer than anyone alive can comprehend. I told you at the start that the thing Silas warned me about was not the strangest part of this story. This is what I meant. The strangest part is not that something walks that ridge. The strangest part is why. The strangest part is that it might be the only thing standing between us and whatever is under the lid. Let me get back to Silas himself, because I have been giving you the pattern, and the pattern is important, but you did not come here for a lecture. You came here because an old man in the mountains saw something, and I want you to see it the way he saw it, up close, in the dark, with your own heart pounding." The last few years of his life, Silas did not trap much anymore. His knees were gone and his eyes were going, and he stayed close to the cabin. But he still kept the salt lines fresh and the iron over the doors, every single day, without fail, a ritual as fixed as breathing. And in those last years he told me the story he had never told anyone, the story of the night his son died, the one death out of the 3 on that mountain that he said was not the ordinary kind. His son's name was Caleb, and Caleb was a grown man by then with a hard head and a modern education, and Caleb did not believe. He loved his father, and he humoured the old rules, kept the salt because it made the old man happy, but he did not believe, and Silas knew he did not, and it was the great sorrow between them. Caleb thought the line of stone was interesting, an archaeological curiosity, and he wanted to study it properly, document it, maybe bring in people who could tell them how old it really was. And Silas forbade it, absolutely, in a way he had never forbidden his son anything, and Caleb, being a grown man and a stubborn one, decided he would do it anyway, quietly, without upsetting the old man. He went up on the ridge one evening in the fall with a camera and a notebook and a little folding shovel, meaning only to clear the dirt from the base of one stone, just to expose enough of it to photograph and measure, telling himself he was not really breaking his father's rule because he was not moving anything, only looking. And that is the trap. Do you see it? The thing does not need you to move a stone. It only needs you to decide, in your heart, that you are the kind of person who might. It watches for that decision. It had been watching Caleb for years, learning him, learning the voices of everyone he loved, waiting for the evening he would carry a shovel up the ridge and kneel down in the dark beside the lid and start to dig. Silas woke that night to the smell of wet clay in his own cabin, inside the salt line, inside the iron. And that was impossible. It had never happened in his whole long life. The salt had always held, and he lay there in the dark with the smell thick around him and understood that the smell was not the thing coming in. The smell was the thing telling him it had already been out, that it had already done what it did. And then he heard Caleb's voice, from outside, from up the ridge, calling for him. Calling, "Dad, Dad, come quick, I need you," in a voice cracked with a fear Silas had never heard his grown son use. And every part of him that was a father wanted to run up that mountain in the dark. But Silas knew the rules. He knew them better than any man living, and he knew, with a certainty that broke him, that his son was already gone, because the thing does not borrow the voice of the living. It had never once, in all the stories, in all the graves, used the voice of a person who was still alive. It uses the voices of the dead. It had used a wife's voice to a husband while she slept, yes, but she had been near death that night herself, Silas came to believe, closer than anyone knew. The voice at the edge of the firelight is always, always, a voice that has just gone silent somewhere else in the world. So when Silas heard his living son's voice calling him up the ridge in the dark, he understood that his son was no longer living, and he did the hardest thing a man has ever done. He did not answer. He lay in his bed inside the salt and the iron, and he listened to the thing wear his boy's voice and beg him, all night, "Dad, Dad, please, I am hurt, I am scared, come find me." And he did not answer, and he did not move, and he did not run to his son, because his son was already dead, and the only thing that would come of answering was one more pair of boots set neatly at the edge of the timber, pointing into the woods. They found Caleb the next morning at the base of the stone he had meant to photograph. His little folding shovel was open beside him, and there was a handful of dirt cleared from the foot of the stone, no more than that, a single handful, the beginning of a dig that never got past its own first minute. There was no mark on him. His eyes were open, and his boots were off, set side by side, 10 feet away, laced, pointing up the ridge into the timber, though he had died with his bare feet in the cold dirt at the foot of the wall. Silas never forgave himself for not going, and he never once doubted that not going had been right, and he carried both of those things at the same time for the rest of his life, which is the particular hell that the thing on the ridge builds for the people it does not even bother to take. He put his son in the ground on the mountain, and he went back to keeping the salt lines fresh, every day, without fail. And he waited, patient in his own way now, the way the thing was patient, to see which of them would outlast the other. I need to tell you now about my own night on that ridge, because I would not have the right to ask you to take any of this seriously if I had not gone up there myself, and because what happened to me is the reason I am the one telling you this, instead of leaving it in a drawer where it could not frighten anybody. Silas died in the winter, in his sleep, inside his salt lines, an old man finally allowed to go the ordinary way. And in the spring I went back to that country to settle a few things and to see the cabin one more time, and I will be honest with you, I went with a notebook and a camera and a little folding shovel of my own, because I am a curious man, and I do not believe I am immune to my own curiosity, and I wanted, God help me, to see the line of stone with my own eyes. I told myself the same lie that Caleb told himself. I told myself that looking was not digging. I found the line without much trouble, because Silas had drawn me that slate map a dozen times over the years, and I knew the ridge by heart from his telling of it. And there they were, the stones, squared, worked, laid end to end along the spine of the ridge, running off into the laurel in both directions farther than I could see, each one furred with moss and half sunk in the leaf litter of uncounted autumns, and each one, when I brushed the dirt away from its edge, showing that same impossible precision, that same flat true face, that same tight-fitted joint with its neighbour, that no frost heave and no root and no century had been able to pry apart. I ran my hand along the top of the wall, and I felt the cold coming off the stone even in the spring sun, and I understood, in my body before my mind caught up, that Silas had told me nothing but the truth. And down in the seam between two of the stones, where the joint should have been solid, I saw the iron. A black spike of it, hand-forged, thick as my wrist, driven down between the courses and vanishing into the dark of the wall below, and it was not rusted to nothing the way 300 years of weather should have left it. It was black and sound and whole, forged from a metal that had not surrendered to time the way iron is supposed to surrender, and I have thought about that spike every day since, because everything I know about metallurgy tells me it should not exist, and there it was, holding shut a lid that the builders of a drowned world did not want opened. I did not dig. I want you to know that I did not dig. I knelt there beside the wall with my little shovel in my hand, and I felt the pull of it, the same pull Caleb must have felt, the reasonable and civilized and utterly deadly urge to clear away just a little more dirt, to expose just enough to photograph, to know. And what stopped me was not courage, and it was not wisdom. What stopped me was the smell. Because as I knelt there with the shovel in my hand and the decision forming in my heart, the air changed, and up out of the warm spring ground came the cold thick reek of wet clay, of turned creek bank, of a fresh grave, rolling over me so suddenly and so heavily that I gagged, exactly as the preacher's sons had gagged, exactly as Silas had smelled it in the frozen February of his boyhood. And I understood that it had been watching me the whole time, that it had let me find the wall, that it had waited, patient, to see whether I was a person who would only look or a person who would dig, and that the smell was its way of asking me, one last time, which one I was going to be. I put the shovel down. I stood up, slow, and I did not run, because I had been told 1,000 times that you never run. And I walked back down that ridge in the last of the daylight with the smell fading behind me and the hair standing up on every inch of my body, and I did not look back, and I made it to the cabin as the sun went down, and I salted the threshold with Silas's own salt from Silas's own crock, and I sat up all night with an old horseshoe in my lap like a frightened child, and sometime in the deepest part of that night, from up on the ridge, in the dark, I heard my own name, called in a voice I knew, called in the voice of Silas Renfro, dead and buried up on that same mountain not 4 months before, calling me by name the way he used to, easy and dry and a little amused, telling me to come on up, that he had something to show me, that it was all right, that he had been wrong about the rules all along, and he wanted to tell me the truth of it before it was too late. And it was his voice, down to the little rasp of his pipe smoke, down to the way he leaned on the first syllable of my name. Every part of me that had loved that old man, that had sat by his stove for years and listened to him and buried him and grieved him, wanted to answer, wanted to say, "Silas, is that you?" wanted to climb that ridge in the dark and find my old friend waiting for me. And that is the whole horror of it, do you understand? That is the exact trap that had taken his son and the preacher and the timbermen, the trap that is baited not with fear but with love, with the voice of the person you would most want to hear, saying the thing you would most want to hear them say. I did not answer. I gave it nothing. I sat there inside the salt and the iron, and I let it wear my dead friend's voice and call to me until the birds started up at dawn, and I have never in my life been so glad to see grey light in a window. When the sun was full up, I loaded my truck and I drove off that mountain, and I have not been back, and I never will go back, and I burned the little folding shovel in a barrel in my own backyard, which I am aware makes no sense, and which I would do again tonight without a moment's hesitation. So now you know why, I believe. Not because of the tracks in the snow, which I did not see, and not because of the vanished timbermen, whom I never met, and not even because of the wall and the iron spike, which I did see and touch, and which shook me to my foundations. I believe because it called me by name in the voice of a dead man, and I heard it, and there is no explanation for that which lets me sleep, and I have stopped trying to find one. But belief is not the reason I am telling you this. If it were only about whether some creature haunts one ridge in one county in Virginia, I would keep it to myself and let those woods keep their own secret. I am telling you because of the pattern, and because of the lid, and because of what the pattern and the lid mean for you, sitting where you are, thinking you are safe and far away from any of this. Here is what I have come to believe, and I am going to say it plainly, and you can weigh it however you see fit. I believe the Great Burying was real. I believe there was a first world, older and stranger, and in some ways greater than our own, and that it built in cut and fitted stone all over this earth, and that something came down over it, a wall of mud and water, a reset, a drowning, in an age our official history has been carefully cleaned of, and that the second world, our world, grew up over the top of it in ignorance. I believe the buildings that sit sunk to their second stories in our cities, the star forts on every continent, the walls in the northeast woods, and the mounds in the river valleys, and the line of stone on Silas Renfrew's ridge, are all the tops of the drowned first world showing through, the last inch of the drowning hand. And I believe that in a few places, a very few, the builders of that first world knew what was coming, and did not only build to survive it. They built to contain something. They laid lids. They pinned them with iron the second world cannot make. And they left watchmen. I do not know what is under the lid on that ridge. Silas did not know. His grandfather did not know. Nobody has looked in living memory, because everybody who tried to look is dead, with their boots pointing into the woods. But I know what the watchman does. It keeps us from looking. It hunts the diggers, and it spares the lookers. And it has done so with a patience that spans the whole age of the second world, because it understands something that we, in our restless, curious cleverness, do not want to understand. It understands that some doors were shut on purpose, that the Great Burying was not only a disaster, that it was also, in places, a burial in the truest sense, the deliberate covering over of something that the first world, with all its lost knowledge and its unrusting iron, judged too dangerous to leave in the open air. And now think about our own age. Think about what we do. We are the second world at the height of its confidence, and we do not believe in lids. We dig. We survey and excavate and core sample and ground penetrate and LiDAR map every square foot of this earth, and we tell ourselves that knowledge is always good and that a thing hidden is always a thing waiting to be found, and we have no watchman at all, because we do not believe there is anything that needs watching. We would look at Silas Renfrew's line of stone, and we would not smell the warning. We would bring in a crew and a grant and a permit, and we would clear the dirt and lift the stones and pull the black iron spikes and open the seam, in the daylight, prayed over by nobody, absolutely certain that our science was armour enough. Just like the preacher, just like Caleb, just like the timbermen who answered the dark when it called their names. Let me widen the lens now, because I do not want you to think this is only about one ridge and one old man, and because Silas himself, in his own plain way, understood that his mountain was one small window into something that stretches across the whole face of the earth. Consider the star forts. If you have never gone looking for them, go and look, and prepare to lose a great deal of sleep. There are hundreds of them, and by some counts far more than hundreds, scattered across every inhabited continent, From the coasts of Europe to the interior of South America, to the plains of India, to the old cities of Africa, and yes, all across North America. Right here, in places our history says were untouched wilderness at the time these things were supposedly built. And they share a design of such precise and repeating geometry, a many-pointed star of walls and bastions laid out with a mathematical exactness, that when you see a dozen of them side by side, you cannot escape the feeling that they came from one mind, one school, one lost body of knowledge that somehow expressed itself identically in places that had no way of talking to each other. The official story tells us they were fortifications, military engineering, an idea that happened to occur to everyone everywhere at roughly the same time, and maybe, but the official story also cannot tell you, with any confidence at all, who built many of them, or exactly when, or how a design this consistent spread across a world that supposedly had no shared knowledge, and it especially cannot tell you why so many of them sit, today, with their lowest works sunk into the ground, drowned to the same waterline as everything else from that vanished age. Consider the buildings sunk to their second stories. Once you learn to see it, you will see it in your own town. The grand old stone structure downtown, whose windows at street level are stubby and half buried, whose true front door is now 3 steps down below the sidewalk, whose proportions only make sense if you imagine the ground around it a full story lower than it sits today. The official story is always the same and always reasonable and always, when you have seen it 40 times, maddening. They raised the streets. They filled it in for drainage. The soil simply accumulated. And each of those explanations works fine for one building. It is only when you notice that it is every building of a certain age, in city after city, on continent after continent, all drowned to the same depth, that the reasonable explanations begin to feel less like history and more like a story we tell so that we do not have to ask the frightening question. The question being, what if the ground did not rise slowly over centuries? What if it rose all at once? What if there was a tide of mud and water, a great burying, exactly as an old mountain grandmother told her grandson it had been, and the second world simply built on top of the drowned first world and agreed, without ever quite saying so out loud, never to look too hard at the foundations? Consider the mounds. Right here in the river valleys of this continent there once stood earthen cities larger than the great cities of Europe of the same era, with plazas and pyramids and populations in the tens of thousands, and they were ploughed flat and built over, and denied and reduced in the official memory to the work of some vanished and conveniently anonymous people, and the very idea that the ancestors of anyone still living could have built them was fought against, for a long time, with a strange and telling ferocity. Why the ferocity? Why does the record fight so hard, again and again, against its own deep past? Silas would have had a simple answer. He would have said that a lie about the burying has to be maintained, and that maintaining it means fighting anything that reminds people the first world was ever there. I am not asking you to swallow all of this whole. I am a man who sat in an old trapper's cabin and touched an iron spike that should not exist, and heard a dead man call my name, and I am aware that this places me at a certain remove from the comfortable centre of respectable opinion. What I am asking you to do is what Silas asked me to do, which is to hold the pieces in your 2 hands at the same time and feel their weight together, the line of stone, the unrusting iron, the wall that runs down into the mountain to a depth no wall should reach, the buried buildings in your own town, the star forts on every continent, the mounds, the grandmother's word for the great burying that is the same word, in 100 unconnected mouths, for the flood, the deluge, the reset, the drowning of the first world. And, standing watch over one small lid on one small ridge in the Virginia backwoods, a thing that borrows the voices of the dead, and leaves tracks that change their stride, and has kept its post with an inhuman patience since before this county had a name. There is one more account I owe you before I give you the last of the rules, and it is the one that connects the Trapper's Ridge most directly to the wider hidden history, because it is the story of a man who came to that mountain precisely because of an old map, and who died for having believed the map more than the warning. Silas told me about him near the very end, and I could tell it cost him to tell it, because this one was not family, and was not a fool, and was not a proud preacher swinging a maul. This one was a careful, quiet, educated man, a surveyor, who came into that country a long time ago with a leather case full of old documents and a manner of speaking that made the local men trust him more than they usually trusted outsiders. He had found, in an archive in some eastern city, the very map I told you about earlier, the older of the two survivors, the one with the small square mark drawn on that ridge before any settlement was supposed to exist there. And he had done the very thing I did. He had held the pieces in his two hands and felt their weight together, and he had understood that the mark on the map meant a structure, and that a structure in that place, at that date, on that map, was a hole torn straight through the official story of when and by whom this land was first built upon. He was not a treasure hunter, and he was not a thrill seeker. Silas was always careful to say that. He was a man who had glimpsed the edge of the true history and could not let it go, the way none of us who have glimpsed it can let it go, and he had come to that ridge to prove, with instruments and measurements and photographs, that the first world had been there. The local men warned him. Silas's own grandfather warned him, sat him down and told him about the line and the lid, and the watchman told him plainly that the mark on his precious map was not a discovery to be made, but a grave to be left alone. And the surveyor listened and thanked him, and Silas said you could see in the man's face that he had already decided, the way Caleb would decide 2 generations later, the way I nearly decided myself. He had come too far. He had held the map in his hands. He was going to look. He set his transit up on the ridge, and he ran his lines, and he measured the stones. And Silas's grandfather, who had a soft spot for the man despite everything, went up with him in the daylight to keep an eye on him. And it was the grandfather who saw the thing that the surveyor's instruments could not. He saw that the line of stone did not run straight the way a wall should run. He saw that it curved, very slightly, very deliberately, and that if you followed the curve in your mind and drew it all the way around, it did not make a wall at all. It made a ring. A great buried ring of fitted and iron-pinned stone, enclosing a space along the top of that ridge better than a 1/4 mile across, and the ridge inside the ring, the ground the surveyor was standing on, was not the natural top of the mountain. It was fill. It was the great burying itself, the mud and the water dried to earth and grown over with 300 years of forest, heaped up inside a ring that the builders had raised to hold it, or to hold whatever the fill was covering, capped and pinned and left, with the tops of its enclosing stones showing through like the rim of an enormous drowned vessel. The surveyor did not believe it at first, and then his own measurements began to prove it, and Silas said that was the moment the man changed, because a lie you can walk away from. But his own instruments, his own careful, honest numbers, were telling him that he was standing inside a made thing of impossible age and scale, a work of the first world capped and buried on purpose, and there is no walking away from your own honest numbers. He stayed on that ridge past the daylight. He stayed into the thin time of the dusk, against every warning, because he had to get one more set of readings. He had to be sure, and the grandfather begged him to come down, and finally had to leave him there alone as the light failed, because the grandfather knew the rules, and would not himself be on that ridge in the between time for any map in the world. They found the transit still standing the next morning, level and true on its tripod, pointed at the line of stone. They found his leather case, and his notebook, open, the last page covered in his careful figures, and then, at the very bottom, in a hand that had gone loose and strange, a single line that was not a measurement. Silas would only tell me part of what it said. He said the surveyor had written, "It is not a wall, it is a door, and it is not locked from our side," and below that, nothing, and 10 feet from the transit, at the edge of the timber, his boots, side by side, laced, pointing into the woods. It is not locked from our side. I have carried that sentence for years now, and it is the single most frightening thing in this entire account, more frightening than the tracks or the voices or the vanished men, because of what it implies about the whole arrangement. We think of a lid as something we might lift, a door as something we might open, and we picture ourselves on the outside, the ones with the choice, the ones who decide whether to look. But the surveyor, in his last honest reckoning, understood that the door in the ridge was not built to keep us from getting in. The iron, the ring, the watchman, the whole terrible patient apparatus, it is not there to stop us from opening the door. It is there to keep the door from being opened from below. We are not the diggers it fears. We are only the fools who might, from the wrong side, help. That is why the thing spares the lookers and takes the diggers. A looker does no harm. A looker stands at the rim of the drowned vessel and marvels and goes home. But a digger, a person who clears the dirt and pulls the iron and works a stone loose from the ring, is a person doing, from the outside, the exact work that something on the inside has been doing, with infinite patience, for the whole age of the second world. The digger and the thing under the lid are, without the digger ever knowing it, working together, and the watchman on the ridge exists to make sure they never finish the job. I do not know if that is true. I want to be honest with you one final time. I do not know if there is a door in that ridge, or a ring of buried stone a quarter mile across, or anything on the far side of it at all. I know what I touched and what I smelled and what called me by name in a dead man's voice, and I know what an old and truthful man told me across his wood stove over many years, and I know what one careful surveyor wrote in a loosening hand as the last light went out of a Virginia dusk. Weigh it as you will. But when I put those things in my two hands together, the weight of them tells me that the great burying covered more than cities, and that in a few places our ancestors were not only survivors of it but wardens over it, and that a line of stone on a lonely ridge is one of the places where the second world presses right up against a door it does not remember shutting, held closed by iron it cannot make, and watched over by a patience it cannot comprehend. Now let me give you the rest of the rules, the ones I have not told you yet, because if you take nothing else from this, I want you to take these, and I want you to take them seriously, even if you decide the rest of it is only a story. Because the woods are real whether the thing is or not, and the rules Silas gave me are the accumulated dying wisdom of people who did not have the luxury of deciding it was only a story. Never travel the ridges at the last light of dusk, or the first light of dawn. Those are the two thin times, Silas said, the times when the line between the seen and the unseen goes soft, and they are the times the thing moves. If you must be in the deep woods, be there in the full dark where it cannot pretend to be a trick of your eyes, or in the full day where it will not come at all, but never in the between times, because the between times belong to it. Carry salt and carry iron, and do not think of them as charms. Think of them as the earth's own clean bones and clean blood, the hard true things the mud could not make and cannot abide. A line of salt across your threshold, a piece of cold iron over your door and in your pocket. Silas swore by both, and he lived to be older than any man on that mountain had a right to, alone, at the foot of the very ridge the thing walked, and I do not think that was luck. Never speak your own true name aloud in the deep woods, and never let another person call you by it there. The thing learns names. It collects them the way it collects voices, and a name spoken in those woods is a name it can use, against you and against everyone who loves you. The old people, Silas said, had use names and true names for exactly this reason, and they did not spend their true names cheaply, and neither should you. If the smell of wet clay comes to you in a place and a season where there is no clay to smell, stop whatever you are doing and leave. Do not investigate. Do not tell yourself it is a fox or a bog or a dead thing under the leaves. The smell is the warning that comes before, and it is the one mercy the thing gives you, the one moment where it is still asking you a question instead of answering it. Leave while it is still a question, and never, ever dig. I have said it before, and I will say it again, because it is the rule that all the other rules are really protecting. Do not open the ground, do not move the stones, do not go down after what the builders buried. The line is a lid, not a fence, and the thing that walks it is not there to keep you out. It is there to keep the lid shut. And every person it has ever taken was a person who, in their heart, had decided to lift it. Silas is buried up on that mountain now, beside his son, inside a little iron fence that the family put up long ago, and that I have come to think was never only decoration. I go and I stand at the bottom of the mountain sometimes, in the full light of the middle of the day, and I do not go up, and I say what I have to say from there, and the ridge above me is quiet and green and utterly ordinary looking, the way the most dangerous places always are. And somewhere along the spine of it, under the moss and the leaf litter, the line of stone runs on, and the black iron holds, and the lid stays shut, and the watchman keeps its post, patient beyond all human patience, waiting for the next person to come up the ridge with a shovel, and a civilized certainty that looking is not the same as digging. I think about the second world a great deal now, our world, the confident digging world, and I wonder how many lids we have already lifted without ever knowing they were lids. I wonder how many watchmen we have driven off or paved over or explained away. I wonder whether the Great Burying was only a catastrophe, a thing that happened to the First World, or whether some part of it was a choice the First World made, a shutting of doors, a covering over of things too dangerous to leave in the light, and whether in our restless, clever certainty we are slowly, everywhere, all at once, undoing the one wise thing our ancestors ever did. I do not know. Silas did not know. But he knew the shape of the danger, and he spent his whole life keeping one small lid shut, and he lost a son to it, and never once wished he had chosen differently. And if a man like that tells me some ground is better left unturned, I am inclined, at this point in my life, to believe him. And here is the thought that will not leave me alone, now that I have told you all of it. The Second World is not slowing down. If anything, the digging is speeding up. There are teams now that can map the shape of the ground beneath a whole forest from the air, that can strip away the trees in a computer and lay bare every mound and wall and buried line hidden under 300 years of growth. And every year they find more, and every year the maps of the hidden works of this continent grow more crowded, and the people making those maps feel, I promise you, exactly the clean, bright thrill of discovery that the surveyor felt on that ridge, with his transit and his leather case. They do not smell the wet clay. They are looking at a screen 100 miles away. There is no thin dusk light, and no line of iron, and no old man to beg them down off the mountain. There is only the pattern, resolving out of the data, more and more of it, all over the earth, the drowned First World showing through wherever we point our instruments, and a confidence, a certainty, that finding is always good, and that a thing hidden is only a thing not yet catalogued. I do not know how many of the lines they are mapping are only walls, and I do not know how many of them are lids. And I do not think they know either, and that is the part that keeps me at the foot of that mountain in the daylight, saying what I have to say and never going up. Because Silas Renfro spent his whole life learning to tell the difference between a wall and a lid, between a place you may look and a place you must leave, and he paid for that knowledge with a son, and he handed it to me across a wood stove as the most precious and terrible thing he owned, and the world we live in now has no way to receive it. We have unlearned the smell of the warning. We have thrown away the salt and the iron. We have decided, as a whole confident civilization, that there is nothing that needs watching, and we have driven off or paved over the watchman, and we are digging, everywhere, all at once, with a shovel in one hand and an old map in the other, telling ourselves the same gentle lie that took every soul this story has counted, that looking is not digging, that we only want to see. So that is the warning of the old Appalachian trapper, and I have carried it as faithfully as I know how, and now it belongs to you. If you walk in wild and lonely country, and most of us still can if we choose to, then carry the rules with you. The salt and the iron, the silence when the dark says your name, the leaving, while it is still a question, when the smell of wet clay finds you where no clay should be. And above all, the last rule, the one that is really a rule about the whole restless Second World, and not only about one ridge in Virginia. Some things were buried on purpose, some lids were meant to stay shut, and the wisest thing a curious creature can ever learn is the difference between looking and digging, and the discipline to stop at the line. Silas Renfro told me there are 3 rules for walking the Virginia backwoods after dark, and I have given you far more than 3, and every one of them is a grave, and every one of them is a gift. Honour them. And if you ever stand on a lonely ridge at the thin edge of the daylight and smell wet clay come up out of ground that has no clay in it, do not answer, do not dig, and do not, whatever you do, follow the voice that knows your name. If this reached something in you, if it named a feeling you have carried in wild places your whole life without ever having words for it, then stay with me, because the next place we are going is deeper and older and stranger than this ridge, and the pattern only grows clearer the farther in we walk. The First World left more than one lid, and some of the others are a great deal closer to home than a mountain in Virginia. They are under towns you have driven through. They are under fields you have walked across. They are, in a few quiet places, under the very ground where the confident Second World has decided to break new soil this very season, with no old trapper anywhere near to smell the warning and beg the diggers down. That is where we are going next, and it is closer to you than this ridge ever was. And once you have seen it, you will understand why Silas kept his salt lines fresh every single day of his long life without once complaining of the trouble. Keep the salt, keep the iron. Learn the difference between looking and digging, and I will see you, in the full light of day, on the far side of the next ridge.